Hello. We're beginning our discussion of Toni Morrison's Beloved. I know it's a complex novel, and I'm hoping that this brief lecture will help introduce you to the book and help you think about some of the key strategies going on in the novel and also some of the key themes. So hopefully you'll sort of know what to look for as you're reading, and it'll help the novel make more sense to you. Toni Morrison won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and the National Book Award for Beloved, the two highest honors in American literature. Not long after that, she won the Nobel Prize for Literature as well. In 2006, the New York Times ranked Beloved as the best work of fiction published between 1981 and 2006. So it's a really important book. So I'm wondering what your impressions are so far. You've gotten a fair way into the novel. Sometimes students are a little confused. Actually, most readers are a little confused, at least, by sort of how the narrative is set up. You know, it's not chronological. We begin at a certain point in time, and a lot of the narrative is in flashbacks to earlier times when Sethe and some of the other characters were still slaves in Kentucky. And I hope you have been thinking a little bit about why Morrison might have set up the narrative that way. I did make a timeline available to you. You can click on that from the syllabus, and that will help you see a chronological description of what happens in the novel, in case you're trying to figure out, okay, when did this thing happen? What's the relationship between maybe a particular incident and the time period where Sethe is in Ohio and she's now living in 124 with her mother-in-law and at times all of her children, and then later on just with her oldest daughter, or her only daughter that's left. So the timeline might help you figure that out. The third person narrator who's telling the story shifts between omniscient and limited omniscient. Sometimes the narrator is kind of in the mind of a character, and other times the narrator kind of is standing back, sort of looking at the big picture and explaining to us what this fictional world looks like. When you get to the middle of the novel, starting around page 236 up to about 256, there's this really strange section in the novel where it's almost like a poem, and it is written in basically stream of consciousness style, where you're sort of in the subconscious of Sethe, Beloved, and Denver. It's the three women talking to each other, talking to themselves, and it's almost as if they are no longer kind of trapped in their own minds, but they are part of this kind of transparent expression of how they feel together. So another kind of strange thing about the novel is, you may have wondered what happened that caused Beloved to die in the first place. I hope you were able to figure that out. But if you didn't, let me just come out and say that Sethe killed her child. When she saw school teacher coming to take them back to slavery, she was like, you're not taking my daughter back to slavery. I'd rather her be dead than be a slave and be subject to some of the abuse that I was subject to. So she begins to kill all of her children, but she's only able to succeed in killing Beloved, and then she's taken into custody. So the question is, where is the murder described? You'll see in the interview with Morrison that she says that someone asked her exactly where is it, where in the novel does this take place, and she had to go looking. And she said she realized once she did that it's buried. It's an unspeakable thing. And so they all know it for the most part. but they don't talk about it. So we learn about it in a kind of circumspect way as well. It's kind of goes all around it, but not directly addressing it. So there are 3 instances where it's actually alluded to and somewhat described. So that's something to look for. I wanted to tell you about an article that I think is particularly good on this subject by Eusebio L. Rodriguez. It's called The Telling of Beloved. And Rodriguez suggests that what's really important, I mean, the story itself is important, but Rodriguez says, you could go and just read the history of slavery and you'd get a lot of this information. So what's really important about this particular book is the way it tells the story. And he suggests that it is told almost like a jazz song. There's a kind of musical experience of the tragedy that happens. So here's how he describes it. He says, Toni Morrison begins the slow process of conjuring up a world that has receded into the past. For the past, racial and personal, seared into the being of her characters, has to be exorcised, like The Exorcist, sort of pulled out of her, by rememory. Unspeakable, it emerges reluctantly. So it talks about how difficult it is for the characters to allow their minds to kind of remember what happened. And there's some really good description in here about how it is musical, how the narrative is musical. I wanted to read just a little bit of the description of how it's rolled out to us. For example, repetitions. So, I don't know how many of you are musicians, but in jazz, there's often a kind of a theme that is repeated over and over again that happens in lots of kinds of music. And it's like a theme that pulls the whole thing together, that sort of builds in intensity and ultimately reveals kind of the core truth of the piece. And here's what he says about repetition there. He says, the words repeated, you'll notice a lot of repeated words and phrases in the book. You'll hear them come up over and over again. The words repeated are simple but vibrant. Plans repeated to warn slaves not to make any, for they have no future. Anything could happen anytime. Interlinked words, pieces, parts, sections warn a slave about the lack of a unitary self. Here's an example of a repeated word: smile and smiling. These word forms, tossed out casually at first, begin to resound when associated with beloved, who emerges from the water smiling mysteriously, fascinating Denver. They gather more resonance when Sethe connects the smile with her mother's smile and realizes that her mother had smiled when she did not smile. And she realizes what she means by that is that she had had the iron bit in her mouth and it had deformed her face, so that she was just an effect of the bit, like a horse would wear. It's the same smile worn by the Saturday prostitutes who work the slaughterhouse yard on payday. Sethe's own smile, as she makes these connections, is one of knowledge. So it goes on to talk about the rooster that is smiling and actually watches some of the abuse that takes place on Sweet Home Plantation. So it says, smiling, the listener realizes, is a silent statement of endurance. To smile is to know the horror of what it means to be a slave. So the narrator makes words function as musical notes and musical phrases that, again, kind of come back around us, come back through cyclically. So if you're interested in more of what Rodriguez has to say about this and the way that the book is written, the title of the article is called The Telling of Beloved. So other important things to be on the lookout for, there's an important bit of history that you need to know, and if you've already worked on the questions for a class, then you'll know that Margaret Garner's story is a foundation for the story of Sethe. And Margaret Garner was an actual person in history. She was an actual slave who escaped her plantation in Kentucky in January of 1856 with her husband and 4 children, and ran across the frozen Ohio River to Cincinnati. They were caught and destined under the authority of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act to be returned. So Morrison takes some liberty here. She doesn't have them actually returned, but in the story, Garner was caught and had to go back into slavery with her husband and a baby. Early on, Garner killed her older daughter rather than have her return to slavery. And then, this is an interesting tidbit, once they were returned to slavery, to the Gaines plantation, with their 9-month-old baby girl, they were traded at one point, and on their way to the new location, Margaret Garner jumped into the river with her baby girl, and they both drowned. The trial raised questions about whether Margaret could be tried as a citizen if she was not counted as a citizen under the law. Instead, she was counted as property. So that's an important thing to think about as you're answering number 3 on the question sheet. So this story is a really fascinating one, and Morrison was fascinated by this story and did the hard work of going back and sort of exploring it in her imagination what would go through a woman's mind that would motivate her to kill her own child. And she attributes it to love. So as you are reading, I want you to think about what the central conflict is, and there may be more than one conflict, but see if you can identify a kind of central conflict. What's pushing the narrative forward? What are we trying to understand? What is it Sethe is going through? And if she grows in some way, as we want the protagonist to do in any novel, in what way does she grow? The novel works on a symbolic level as well as historic, so I want you to think about some of the metaphors of the story and what they represent. Number 1, the baby ghost. What does the ghost represent? Number 2, the tree scar on Sethe's back. Sethe's milk is a third metaphor. It comes up over and over again in the story. Why do we keep going back to that idea about her milk being stolen from her? And Paul D's heart, which is, he describes it as being kept in a rusted box that he doesn't ever open. We have several settings that we need to keep in mind. I know it can get a little confusing at times, but as the story opens, we're at 124 Bluestone Road in Cincinnati, the house where now they live. We also flash back to 1873. That is in 1873, after slavery has ended. But we flash back to the Sweet Home Plantation in Kentucky, and that era covers about 4 decades before slavery ended in the U.S. And then some of the key characters, of course, we have the Garners, and it's interesting that she gives them the name that she got from Margaret Garner's story. So the Garners are the white people that own them. The Bodwins, who help them once they get to Cincinnati. You have the slaves, Sethe, Hallie, her husband, Hallie's mother, baby Suggs, the 3 Pauls, Paul D, Paul A, and Paul F, Sixo, who's Native American, school teacher, who comes to the plantation after Mr. Garner dies, and he's his brother-in-law. And then you have the daughter Denver, Sethe's daughter Denver, and you have some people in the community that they move into in Cincinnati, Stampede and Ella. Those are some kind of important characters. There are lots of characters, but those are some of the most important ones. So as you're finishing the novel, hopefully some of these key ideas and strategies, narrative strategies, will help you think a little bit about what Morrison is trying to accomplish by writing the story the way she does, by having her narrator tell the story in that way. So I look forward to further discussion of the book. Thanks.